The hippie generation of the 1960s evolved into an era known as the Jesus movement. It's where the term Jesus freaks came from. And from this movement, a dark side emerged: religious cults. Often, these cults were led by radicalized and abusive criminals. That's where this tragic story of faith, love, and murder begins. It was a chilly January day in 1981 when the brutally murdered bodies of a young couple were discovered off of Wallaceville Road on the fringes of Houston, Texas. The victims remained unidentified for over 4 decades. Finally, DNA testing revealed their names as Dean and Tina Clouse, and they had a missing child. Now, investigators needed to find their baby, Holly Marie. Come along with me for a ride through odd, strange, and mysterious here at Odd Mysteries Stories. Known as Jesus freaks, these non-traditional Christians embraced a lifestyle that combined elements of the hippie and commune way of living with a fervent belief in Jesus' teachings on love and peace. Most were relatively harmless, opening coffee houses or introducing modern folk-style music into churches. Dean, who was known for being a kind and generous young man, had picked up a pair of hitchhikers. Though they seemed harmless, they may not have been innocent travelers at all. Indeed, they were members of a cult called Christ Family. Dean would eventually join them during his teen years. In fact, before meeting Tina, he'd even traveled with some of them. So when Dean met Tina Lynn in 1978, it was such a relief for his mother, Donna. It seemed that falling in love with the smiling, vivacious brunette had distracted the then 19-year-old Dean from his association with the Christ Family cult, and his dangerous fascination with the Jesus freaks seemed to fade. Tina was only 15 when she met Dean. It was a whirlwind romance. The couple married in June of 1979 and had a daughter named Holly Marie in January of 1980. They were living with Tina's sister, Sherry Green, in Florida. But Dean found work in construction and moved his young family to Lewisville, Texas. It was a small town of 24,000 people, just a few miles northwest of the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Donna sent them off in a 1978 maroon AMC Concorde. Though the car was still in her name, Dean was making payments for it. Before they left, Donna warned Dean to steer clear of the Jesus freaks he'd previously been involved with, and told Tina to call her if anything didn't feel right with him, as they settled out in Texas. The pair and their 1-year-old daughter, Holly, briefly lived with a cousin near Lewisville. It didn't take long for the couple to settle into their new life together. In August of 1980, Tina wrote an enthusiastic letter to her sister, Sherry, saying how happy she was and that they'd found their own apartment. But after Sherry mailed a letter back to Tina in response, it got sent back, returned to sender, with no forwarding address. Sherry estimated that the pair had been in their new home for no more than 3 weeks before they seemed to have moved on. Later, Sherry found out that Dean had rented their new apartment in his father's name and not his own. This fact immediately raised questions and concerns in her mind. While Tina may have been happy, the move was not without its stresses. Dean's construction work was far more sporadic than he'd perhaps expected, so there's reason to believe the young family was suffering some financial pressures. That financial stress may have made Dean, and by extension, Tina, vulnerable when the Christ Family cult re-entered their lives. It's possible, however, that the couple did not return to the cult willingly. Either way, as Dean and Tina immersed themselves in this community, little did they know that their involvement would lead to a tragic and mysterious end. The Christ Family enjoyed its heyday during the 1980s and had over 2,000 members at the height of its popularity. The sect was led by Charles McHugh, who called himself Jesus Christ Lightning Amen. He claimed to be the reincarnation of Jesus Christ. Many members of this cult were harmless. The sect taught its members that they should follow Christ by wandering the world, shunning all possessions, wearing white robes, eating vegan food, and separating themselves from all worldly ties. Members of the group traveled around the country on foot, preached about Jesus, and lived on charity, cast-offs, or food stamps. Grievously, the cult believed that men and women should live separately. Many members changed their names, or adopted the surname Christ. Some members weren't even associated with the sect's leader, McHugh. They adopted the cult's tenets and wandered off in their own way. The movement was somewhat dispersed. Neither Christ family tenets nor the loose hold McHugh had on his members stopped him from sexually abusing many of the females. Yet it still didn't prevent women and men from living together at one of the group's many desert camps spread across the Southwest. At these camps, women were expected to serve men as domestic handmaidens. The emphasis on casting off worldly possessions didn't stop McHugh from opening a bank account in California. He wanted to profit from his leadership and control. Members were expected to contribute to the account by soliciting donations or engaging in other, sometimes less than legal activities. Members were also expected to donate the proceeds from the sale of their worldly goods to his account. In another extreme, Christ family members were told to give up their children, often leaving them with family members or strangers. This supposedly demonstrated that they were worthy of the kingdom of heaven. It was a belief that leaned heavily on a twisted version of a Bible verse in Matthew 19:29, which said, "Everyone who has left houses or brethren or sisters or father or mother or children or lands for my name's sake shall receive 100-fold and shall inherit everlasting life." As you may have gathered, McHugh was not exactly harmless, and plenty of other sect members were equally dangerous. There is even evidence that the Branch Davidians were an offshoot of this group, offering some insight into just how threatening and abusive the cult could be. McHugh eventually became widely known as a megalomaniac and a dangerous psychopath, and he was also a drug trafficker. McHugh convinced his followers that God put marijuana on the earth for man's pleasure. He also claimed that both ingesting and dealing methamphetamine were holy acts that allowed them to continue God's work. In 1987, McHugh was convicted on 5 counts of drug trafficking. On the day he was arrested, deputies found a loaded .45 caliber pistol plus $30,000 in cash and bags of meth in his truck. 10 of his followers faced similar convictions, which included being charged for growing about $1 million worth of marijuana at the cult's ranch. It was not a small operation by any means. Drug dealing was no mere hobby or diversion for many of these so-called humble followers of Christ. Later, McHugh was convicted of child molestation and went to prison. He died at the age of 73 in 2010. Many survivors of his cult have reported disturbing stories of psychological, emotional, and physical abuse. They speak of female members who endured repeated sexual abuse, including some who were beaten within inches of their lives. There are hints of other missing and murdered women who may have had ties to this group. The first sign that Dean, and by extension Tina, had gotten sucked back into religious extremism occurred on November 8, 1980. Philip McGoldrick, the pastor of a Seventh-day Adventist church, heard a knock on the church's back door. When he opened the door, he was confronted by 2 women dressed in white robes. One of them was carrying a baby girl. The women told him they couldn't raise the child because of their nomadic lifestyle, and because couples in their group were required to separate. It is presumed that Tina was probably one of these women, because the baby girl was definitely her daughter, Holly Marie Clouse. The pastor said he was given Holly's birth certificate, along with a note from Dean relinquishing his parental right. The pastor was, of course, taken aback by this event, but it seems he and his wife, Constance, fell in love with the baby and decided to adopt her. The adoption records were sealed, and Holly's true identity would remain a mystery to the outside world for the next 4 decades. Since Dean and Tina were unidentified for more than 40 years after their bodies were discovered, the pastor would have no idea the child was connected to an ongoing unsolved murder case. This church was located in Yuma, Arizona. It is approximately 1,200 miles from Louisville, Texas. Tina had traveled a long road to get to that church on that day in November. It had been just 3 months since her cheerful letter to her sister, so somehow during that time someone managed to convince her that giving up her baby was either God's will or the only way for her to secretly protect her child from the cult. Investigators now believe that Tina ended up in Yuma because she was on her way to the group's winter compound in Blythe, California. Investigators do not know if either she or Dean ever made it to Blythe, or how long they may have remained in Arizona. They were, as the Christ family put it, in the wind. In late December or early January 1980, Dean's mother, Donna, received a chilling phone call from an unknown man. He tried to pass himself off as a police officer or another authority figure. Donna doesn't remember the exact date, but remembers that the caller was vague and said he'd found her car. He was arranging to have it driven back from Los Angeles to her home in Florida. He asked Donna to meet the car couriers at the Daytona Speedway parking lot around midnight. Of course, law enforcement would certainly not handle the return of her vehicle in this way, both suspicious and angry. Donna asked some police friends to come with her. Donna went to the meeting spot and watched a group of women drive up. One of the women introduced herself as Sister Susan. Donna watched the two younger women, who seemed to be in their teens, as they attempted to speak to her. Sister Susan held up an authoritative hand to shush them, and thus was the only one who said another word that night. Sister Susan told Donna that her son and his wife had joined their group and were giving up all their possessions. She also told Donna that Dean and Tina no longer wanted any contact with their families, and then she tried to pressure Donna into donating $1,000 to the Christ family. On the advice of friends who'd come with her, Donna took possession of her car and left. She notified the rest of her family about what had occurred. Family members obviously grieved, but held out hope that Dean, Tina, and Holly were living peacefully in a quiet, beautiful commune somewhere, and that they were happy and healthy. They had no way of knowing that just a week or so later, someone in Texas would locate their brutally murdered bodies. Police searched the car and found no fingerprints, personal belongings, or other evidence. But Donna had a bad feeling about it all and knew something was wrong. She'd saved the mystery caller's phone number and continued calling him to ask questions about the whereabouts of her son. Donna said that the man was cagey and secretive, refusing to provide direct answers to her questions, until one day he lost his temper. He told her smugly that there was a lot of deserted land between California and Florida and that she was never going to find her son. It was the last phone call Donna had with the man. Could it be that she was actually speaking with her son's killer the entire time? Was the man on the other end of the phone McHugh himself? This happened in the era of landlines. If police ever tracked down the address or other information about who that phone number was linked to, they've never released information about it. Meanwhile, on January 6, 1981, the Harris County Sheriff's Department received a call from a man named Kerry Cox. He'd found a decomposed arm in the mouth of his German Shepherd. Cox described the arm as wrinkled, waterlogged, and pale. The police began searching the area, and on January 11, 1981, they found the remains of Dean and Tina Clouse near Wallaceville Road in Houston, Texas. Houston is 266 miles away from Louisville, where the couple lived. It's not clear how or why they ended up in Houston. The location of the bodies wasn't easy to find. The remains were in a marshy, wet area filled with dense vegetation. The corpses had been stashed behind a locked gate at the end of a dirt road, an unpaved portion of Wallaceville Road. It was an area with very few homes and no businesses. Investigators came to believe the couple had died together, with Dean attempting to defend and protect his wife, Tina. They were already dead by the time their bodies were dumped in the marsh. They also hypothesized that the killer had to have been familiar with the Houston, Texas area. At the time, the deceased was not carrying IDs or other personal effects, and investigators were unable to identify the bodies. Investigators nicknamed the couple Romeo and Juliet. However, they were able to determine the manner of death. Tina had been savagely strangled. Dean had been bound and beaten and died due to a fractured skull. The killer left a bloody towel behind, as well as a pair of green gym shorts with a 25-inch waist. Basically, though, viable leads were reduced to zero. Police had reconstructions created of the pair's faces and released them to the public in the hopes of getting tips that might tell them who the couple was or why they were murdered. But either the reconstruction wasn't accurate enough Or the news outlets didn't carry the story all the way to Florida because Dean and Tina's families didn't see them or make the connection. In 1981, the investigation was essentially over before it had properly begun. In 2011, police exhumed the bodies of their unidentified Romeo and Juliet. They extracted DNA, but they were still unable to match the DNA to any law enforcement databases. At that time, DNA was only taken from criminals, or occasionally the families of individuals who had submitted missing person reports. Everything changed in 2021 when Misty Gillis, a forensic genealogist, came across the Romeo and Juliet case on the Doe Network. Gillis teamed up with Alison Peacock. Together, they built the unidentified couple's family trees, and within days, they had identified Dean and Tina's relatives. They called Tina's sister, Sherry Green, to inform her of what they had found. After Alison Peacock broke the news that Dean and Tina had been murdered, the families asked about their child, Holly Marie. It was the first indication to investigators that there was even a baby involved. At first, there was speculation that the child had also been killed, and that her small body had been dragged away by scavenging animals or was missed at the crime scene. Another theory was that Holly had been kidnapped by the killers and was still alive. As the search for Holly had unfolded over the years, investigators speculated that if she were still alive, she might be unaware of her true identity and the tragic past that had shaped her life. This hypothesis proved to be correct. The investigation into Holly's disappearance had been complicated further by confusion over the spelling of her name. Some agencies referred to her as Holly, spelled with an I and an E, while others used the spelling with the letter Y at the end. When investigators requested her birth certificate, they discovered that it had been sealed due to an adoption. It didn't take long for them to track down the baby's sealed records and uncover Holly's adoption certificate using a court order. In a stunning turn of events, Dean and Tina's 1-year-old daughter, Holly Marie, was found alive and well in Oklahoma on June 7, 2022, a date that eerily coincided with what would have been Dean's birthday. She was 42 years old. Out of respect for Holly's privacy, few details about her life have been made public. However, it has been revealed that she has led a fulfilling life, blessed with a loving marriage of 20 years, 5 children, and 2 young grandchildren. The specifics of her childhood remain confidential due to the ongoing investigation into her parents' deaths, but authorities have stated that her adoptive family has never been considered suspects in her case. Holly went on to publish a book called Finding Baby Holly, which I'll link in the description. The miraculous discovery of Holly adds a bittersweet chapter to the haunting tale of Dean and Tina Clouse, leaving many questions unanswered, but offering a saving grace amidst the darkness. Remember Sister Susan? She was one of the women who returned the car to Dean's mother, Donna. On November 3, 2022, a woman who claimed to be Sister Susan contacted reporter Christina Corbin, who was working on a podcast called What About Holly? At the time, she made Corbin conceal her identity from the camera, but showed up dressed in a white tunic and white pants. The reporter described her as polite. Sister Susan said that the world misunderstands the Christ family. She said she joined the group at age 21 during a time when she was praying with her whole heart. She claimed that she'd traveled the whole world and described adopting a life that involved no violence, no sex, and no materialism. It was a life she described as wonderful and beautiful. She went on to describe Dean and Tina as saints. Susan also claimed that Dean and Tina weren't meant to give up their child forever, but only while they were on a pilgrimage. She claimed that Dean had indeed joined the Christ family long before he'd met Tina or gone to Texas. She also clarified that she was not one of the women who went to the church to give the baby up for adoption. But she did talk about the camp in Blythe, California. Investigators had suspected that Tina was on her way to Blythe when she dropped off baby Holly in Yuma, Arizona. Sister Susan said that it was the base of operations for Lightning Amen, known to us as the cult's leader, Charles McHugh. She described the camp as a paradise. She said there were 30 to 60 people at the camp at any one time, coming and going at will. Note that this camp is still in operation more than 40 years after Dean and Tina's murder. Susan essentially painted Donna as a liar when she described returning the car. She said that she had simply volunteered to take the vehicle back to Donna. She doesn't remember anyone asking her to do so. She claimed she'd traveled to Florida with her brother, even though Donna mentioned 2 other women at that incident. Susan denied that she'd ordered these women not to speak because they weren't there, and claimed she had no idea about a phone call that some man had made to Donna about the car. Susan said that returning property was one of her regular roles for the Christ family. Susan also denied asking Donna for a financial donation to her group. In her version of the story, she merely asked Donna to chip in for gas money when they talked over the phone, before dropping off the car. She claimed that, when she and her brother arrived, they were surrounded by cops and forced to sit on the curb until Donna drove away with the car. She insisted that Donna left without speaking to her and didn't ask any questions about Dean, Tina, or Christ family itself. Sister Susan also denied that members of the group were ever required to cut ties with family members. She said that Dean and Tina left the camp in Blythe together and alive of their own free will, and of course also denied any knowledge of or involvement in the murders. There are so many discrepancies between Donna and Susan's stories. Who do you think is telling the truth? The police say that they've cleared Sister Susan, plus 50 other members of the Christ family, of any wrongdoing. But Dean and Tina's trek from Yuma to Houston, where they were murdered, is a big question mark to investigators. At this point, police have very little information about the events that ended with Dean and Tina lying dead in a potter's field in Houston, but it's clear that McHugh used his cult, at least in part, to run drugs. The Justice Department notes that methamphetamine violence posed a significant threat to Texas back in the early 1980s. Criminal violence is commonly associated with meth production, distribution, and abuse. The Texas Mafia, a gang that operated in and out of Texas prisons, got its start during this time. Meth moved across the American Southwest and into Texas quite often. The Christ family was based mainly in desert camps in California and New Mexico, but passed into Texas too. Traffickers were known to use Interstates 10, 20, and 35 as primary routes. The crime scene on Wallaceville Road in Houston is not far from the I-10. It's only a short 12-minute drive. And the camp in Blythe was also off I-10, which runs from Jacksonville, Florida, to Los Angeles, California. Could Dean and Tina have been forced to run drugs up to Houston? If so, did they run afoul of the contact or dealer they were supposed to meet? It's also possible Dean and Tina learned something about the drug trafficking operation and planned to go to the police. Perhaps someone within the drug trafficking operation murdered the couple and took them to a pre-planned spot in Houston to dump the bodies. Consider that if that German Shepherd dog hadn't found a body part, one of their arms, then Dean and Tina may never have been found, and humidity, along with local wildlife, would have destroyed their remains altogether. In another scenario, the Christ family cult may have been dealing drugs to finance recruitment. It would help pay for their members to travel across the country. In that case, there's a possibility that a competing drug cartel could have considered Dean and Tina to be trespassing on their turf. Killing them would certainly send a clear message to the cult to stay far away from their territory. Donna and several members of both families came to believe that Tina and Dean were attempting to escape the cult when they moved to Texas. Remember that Dean rented his apartment in Louisville in his father's name. It could be that he was trying to avoid being found. That he wanted to leave the cult and create a safe place for Tina and the baby. If that's so, perhaps religious conviction wasn't what prompted Tina to give Holly up for adoption. Maybe she was trying to get the baby permanently out of harm's way because they were trapped in what she knew was a potentially deadly situation. Survivors of the Christ family sometimes communicate on a website called culteducation.com, which I have linked in the story description notes. Several former members of the cult reported being stalked and harassed by cult members after attempting to leave the cult. Such behavior is consistent with the way that many cults behave. We know that Tina and Dean loved each other, and it seems they would not have wanted to be separated. While sister Susan claimed there was no mandatory separation of men and women in the Christ family, and that they left Camp Blythe together, many other sources contradict her position on this subject. In addition, when the pair's remains were found, the bodies were already decomposing. Decomposition can take between 10 days and 2 years, depending on local conditions. The pair could have been murdered at any time between the day Tina was last seen in Yuma and December 28th. This was around the same time frame that the car was being returned to Donna. Did Sister Susan, the mysterious male caller, and the unnamed teenage females with Susan return the vehicle, knowing that Tina and Dean were already dead? Remember, the car had been wiped of prints, indicating a level of cleanup that wouldn't have been necessary were innocent followers of Jesus merely returning property. Is it possible that the car was, in fact, far closer than Los Angeles when Susan drove it home? Did the killer drive Tina and Dean's own vehicle to dump their bodies? The entire debacle could have been meant to keep Donna from realizing her son was dead or filing a missing persons report, thus sparing the Christ family from any scrutiny. Donna did, in fact, file a missing persons report, but only after the car was returned, when it was too late. Of course, believing this theory requires you to believe that Sister Susan's story isn't particularly credible. In one way or another, it's possible Dean knew they were after him, and he was trying to protect his family. Maybe the murders have nothing to do with the cult. When police couldn't find any viable suspects among the Christ family group, they were forced to consider other scenarios. One theory is basically bad luck. Perhaps Dean and Tina had been hitchhiking and had randomly encountered their killer. Maybe it was someone who had a deep-seated hatred for religious cults. Such a scenario would have been ironic since Dean first met Christ family members when he picked them up hitchhiking. This theory is probably the weakest, but it should be considered. Do you believe the random encounter theory is possible? Maybe you can help solve this murder case. You might have helpful information if you were a member of the Christ family or crossed paths with members of the group in 1980 or 1981. You may also have important information if you knew or worked with Dean or Tina in Louisville, or if you happened to encounter them somewhere between Blythe, California and Houston, Texas. Please direct credible tips to the Texas Cold Case and Missing Persons Unit. I've included the link in the story notes. As always, I'm interested to hear your thoughts, insights, and comments about this tragic case. Thank you for joining us at Odd Mysteries Stories. My name is Vince. Check out another one of our murder mysteries. We unravel the details and theories surrounding the brutal killings of Jennifer Short and her parents, and why this case remains cold to this day. To all you true crime enthusiasts and armchair detectives out there, you'll love this story.